My name is Delphine Morrow. I am 33 years old, and I need you to understand something before I say a single word about my wedding, about my aunt, about the secret that detonated in the middle of what was supposed to be the most joyful day of my life. I am a person who believed for a very long time that my family was one thing, a unit, a known quantity. I had a story about who we were. Not a perfect story, not a story without its difficult chapters, but a coherent one, a story with a through line I could trace. I believed I knew the architecture of my own history. I was wrong. I was so completely wrong that when the truth finally arrived, it did not feel like a correction. It felt like demolition. Let me start at the beginning. The real beginning. I grew up in a mid-sized city in North Carolina called Ashworth. Not famous for anything in particular, which is actually the best kind of place to grow up in if you want a childhood that belongs to you rather than to a postcard. Wide streets with old oaks that had been there since before anyone currently living could remember. A downtown that had survived the strip mall era by being stubborn and locally owned. A river that flooded every 3 years like clockwork and that everyone complained about and nobody left because of. My family on my mother's side had been in Ashworth for 4 generations. This matters. This is one of those details that seems like scenery and is actually load-bearing. For generations means deep roots and also deep memory. It means stories that go back further than any single person's recollection. It means the town knew my grandmother before she was someone's grandmother, knew my mother before she was someone's mother, knew me before I had done a single thing to be known for. This can be a comfort and it can be a constraint, and in my family it turned out to be both, sometimes in the same sentence. My mother's name is Lorraine Morrow, née Beaumont. She is 61 years old and she has been the kind of woman who organizes things for as long as I have known her. Not in the bossy way, in the way of someone who genuinely cannot rest if there is disorder in the vicinity, who experiences chaos as a personal affront that she is constitutionally required to correct. She ran the PDA for 6 years. She coordinated the neighborhood watch. She planned every holiday with a spreadsheet that she updated in October. She is warm and funny and formidably competent, and she loves me with the specific intensity of a woman who has made her children the central project of her life, which is both a gift and something I have needed in adulthood to learn to receive in proportionate amounts. My father's name is Howard Morrow. He is 64, retired from a career in civil engineering, a man of few words and careful ones, the kind of man who says 3 sentences where another man might say 30, and whose 3 sentences are worth listening to. He coaches chess at the middle school 2 afternoons a week because he likes young minds and because I think the quiet concentration of a chess room is one of the places he feels most at home. He and my mother have been married for 37 years, and they are one of those couples who became, over the decades, a genuine unit, not in the way that erases individual identity, but in the way of 2 people who have figured out how to be separate and together at the same time, which is the actual achievement of a long marriage. I have 1 sibling, my younger brother Callum, who is 29 and lives in Charlotte with his boyfriend Jerome, and a French bulldog named Archimedes who has more Instagram followers than most humans I know. Callum and I are close in the way that siblings who are different types of people can be close. We don't understand each other's daily texture exactly, but we understand each other's foundation, and in a crisis there is nobody I would rather have standing next to me. Now I need to tell you about my aunt. My estranged aunt. The woman whose name did not appear on the wedding guest list, who was not invited, who was not discussed in any planning conversation, and who appeared at my wedding reception like a ghost who had been given an address and a dress code. Her name is Rosalind Beaumont. She is my mother's younger sister by 4 years. She is 57, and she has been, for as long as I can consciously remember, which is to say for my entire life, a subject that was handled in my family the way certain fragile and dangerous things are handled, carefully, briefly, and then put away. I did not know Rosalind growing up. I knew of her. I knew she existed the way children know about earthquakes, as a real thing, documentable, occasionally referenced in conversation as evidence of something's power, but not a present presence, not something in the room. She lived in other places. There were several states between us at any given time. Occasionally her name would come up, someone would mention something, or a card would arrive at Christmas and my mother's face would do a specific thing, not quite pain and not quite anger, but something in the territory of both. And then the subject would move on smoothly, the way subjects move on in families that have practiced moving on. When I asked about her as a child, I received answers calibrated to my age. They had a falling out. Sometimes families go through difficult periods. It's complicated. When I asked as a teenager, I received the slightly fuller adult version. There were some choices Rosalind made that hurt the family. Your grandmother was very affected by it. It's not a short story and it's not mine entirely to tell. That last phrase, not mine entirely to tell, I have thought about many times since the wedding. My mother was accurate in a way I did not understand at the time. I accepted the mystery of Rosalind the way you accept the mysteries your family hands you when you are young, as given as finished, as not requiring further investigation. I had a full life. I had friends in school and later college and later a career and later, crucially, Theo. Let me tell you about Theo because he is the reason there was a wedding at all, and because understanding what we are to each other is necessary for understanding the full weight of what happened. Theo's full name is Theodore Asante. He is 35 years old. He grew up in Atlanta, the son of a Ghanaian father and a Georgia-born mother who were both academics. His father, Dr. Kwame Asante, is a professor of economics, and his mother, Dr. Patricia Asante, is a historian specializing in African American literature. And growing up in their house meant growing up in a house where ideas were not just welcome but required, where dinner conversations included citation of sources, where books were not decorative and a question unanswered was considered a minor emergency. Theo became an architect. Not the drafting board kind, the kind who thinks about buildings as community infrastructure, who has opinions about who public space is actually built for and why, who has spent his career working primarily on affordable housing projects in community centers and public libraries in under-resourced neighborhoods. He is 6'2" and has the kind of face that reads as serious until he smiles, at which point it becomes something completely different. He is the most principled person I have ever been close to, and I do not mean principled in the rigid way, I mean it in the lived way, the way that means his actions and his stated values are in consistent conversation and he holds himself accountable when they diverge. We met at a conference. I know how that sounds. But I am a documentary filmmaker. I have been for 8 years with a particular focus on stories of communities in transition, and the conference was about urban development and storytelling and the intersection of the two, and Theo was on a panel about architecture as narrative and I was in the audience and he said something that made me stop and write it down, not because it was quotable exactly but because it was the kind of observation that opens a door in your thinking and changes the light. After the panel I went up and told him what he had said had made me see something differently. He said, "Tell me how." We talked for 40 minutes in the conference hallway. He asked for my card. He emailed that night. We dated for 2 years. We were long distance for most of it. He was in Atlanta, I was based in Durham, and the distance was not easy but it was also, in retrospect, useful because it meant that everything we built between us was built deliberately, chosen every time, which gives a foundation a different quality than the kind that grows by proximity and convenience. We moved in together when I relocated to Atlanta for a project that became a longer stay, and then simply became my life. We were engaged at the end of year 3 on a Tuesday evening in our kitchen. No ceremony, no setup, just him looking at me over pasta and saying, "I want to do this with you for the rest of my life. Will you?" I said yes before he had finished the sentence. The engagement was 18 months. We planned a wedding for 200 people, which is more than I wanted and fewer than our combined families considered a minimum, and we arrived at it through the particular negotiation that wedding planning actually is, which is not about flowers and centerpieces but about managing the expectations and emotional investments of everyone who loves you while somehow also getting the day to reflect what you actually are. I was happy. I need you to hold on to that. I was genuinely, rootedly happy in the way that felt like finally, not the finally of relief after long suffering, but the finally of arrival, of finding the place you realize you were moving toward all along. Now I need to tell you about the guest list conversation. The specific conversation because it is where the crack first appeared. About 4 months before the wedding, my mother and I were going over the final guest list at her kitchen table in Ashworth. My father was in the other room. Callum was on the phone from Charlotte with periodic opinions shouted through the doorway. We had been working through the list for 2 hours and it was one of those evenings that feels both tedious and strangely intimate. The going over of names, the remembering of who people are to you, the small negotiations of limited space. At some point my mother said, with a casualness she had clearly worked to construct, "What would you think about including Rosalind?" I looked up from the list. "Your sister Rosalind?" "Yes." I was quiet for a moment. "Mom, I don't know Rosalind. I've met her twice, both times when I was under 10 years old. I wouldn't recognize her on the street." "I know," my mother said. I've been thinking about it though. She reached out recently. She's been going through some things. Health things. Not imminently serious, she says, but it's made her reflective. She reached out and said she'd like to try to reconnect with the family. A pause. With me. I sat with that for a moment. And what do you want? I asked my mother. Not what do you think I want? What do you want? My mother looked at the list. I think I might be ready to try. After a long time of not being ready. Okay, I said. Then I support that. And if she and I develop a relationship as a result, I'm open to that. But I don't think a wedding is the right place to start. I don't know her. She doesn't know me. Having her there would feel. I stopped trying to find the right word. Performative. It would feel like a performance for her benefit rather than a real beginning. My mother nodded. I understand, she said. I think you're right. She made a note on the pad in front of her and moved on. I believed that was the end of it. The way I believed when I was young, that the mystery of Rosalind was finished. It was not finished. Let me tell you about my friend Petra Nikolaidis because she is one of the most important people in this story and because she deserves to be introduced properly. Petra and I have been best friends since the third week of college, when we were assigned to the same small seminar and ended up arguing about the ethics of documentary filmmaking for 2 hours and then went for coffee because neither of us wanted the argument to stop. She is a civil rights attorney in Durham. She is Greek-American, the daughter of parents who immigrated from Thessaloniki in the 80s, and who raised her with a ferocity and warmth and intellectual rigor that shaped her into someone I have always slightly aspired to be. She has been in my life for 11 years and she knows the inside of me the way only someone can who has watched you become yourself in real time. Petra was my maid of honor. She had opinions about everything wedding related that she shared without being asked, and that I mostly appreciated and occasionally needed to manage. She had met my family many times. She liked Callum. She liked my father. She respected my mother, with the specific respect of someone who recognizes a formidable woman and holds her appropriately. The wedding was in May, a Saturday in late May, at a venue outside Ashworth that had a restored old barn and land that went to the tree line and a catering team that Callum had vetted with the rigor he applied to all food-related decisions. The weather was, and I say this with the gratitude of someone who had spent 6 months checking weather forecasts for this specific date, extraordinary. Clear sky, low humidity, the particular gold of late afternoon light in North Carolina that looks like something a painter invented. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. Theo and I had written our own vows, which I had known I wanted and which had been more difficult to write than anything in my documentary career because the stakes were different, because the person receiving them would carry them for the rest of his life, and because the writing of them required me to be more nakedly honest about my own love than I was practiced at being on the page. I had rewritten mine 7 times. Theo, when he told me this afterward, had rewritten his 4 times, which he reported with the self-satisfaction of someone who thought 4 was the right number. The ceremony was beautiful. I will not spend too long on this because the ceremony is not what this story is about, but I want you to know that it was beautiful because I want you to hold the beauty alongside what came after, because both are true and the truth of each does not cancel the other. Theo cried during my vows, not loudly, not theatrically, but in the particular restrained way of a man who is not accustomed to crying and is surprised by it, and I found this more moving than I had expected to find anything. My father walked me down the aisle and held my hand for 3 full seconds at the bottom before he gave me to Theo, and in those 3 seconds communicated something I did not have words for then and have found words for since, that I was his fully and permanently and also Theo's fully and permanently, and that those 2 things were not in competition, and that he was at peace with both. The reception began at 6. The catering was extraordinary. The band, a 6-piece jazz ensemble that Callum had found through Jerome's connections in the Charlotte music scene, was so good that within 40 minutes the oldest guests were dancing, which is the only real metric of a good wedding band. Theo danced with his mother and I danced with my father, and we looked at each other across the dance floor during our respective dances with a particular look that I have since come to think of as one of the peak moments of my life, 2 people who have found each other watching each other knowing it. And then somewhere around 8 o'clock, Petra appeared at my elbow. Petra's face when she is about to tell me something difficult does a specific thing, it goes very still. Not cold, Petra is not cold, but still the way still water is still, giving nothing away on the surface. She had this face on. she said very quietly, close to my ear so that the band would cover it. There's a woman here who I don't recognize and who seems to know a great deal about your family. I turned to look at her fully. What do you mean? I mean, Petra said carefully. She introduced herself to me as your mother's sister. She introduced herself to Theo's mother. She has been talking to the Asante side for 20 minutes, and I just caught the tail end of a conversation in which she told Dr. Patricia something about your grandmother that I don't think was common knowledge. I felt the floor shift under me in the specific way it shifts when something that should be fixed turns out not to be. What did she tell her? I'm not entirely sure, Petra said. Something about your mother. Her name is Rosalind. I put down my champagne glass. I put it down carefully on the nearest table, with the deliberate precision of a person whose hands want to do something less careful. Where is she? Petra tilted her head across the room. She was standing near the bar. Rosalind, my mother's estranged sister, who had not been invited, who I had explicitly, in that conversation 4 months ago at that kitchen table, declined to include. She was tall, taller than my mother, with dark hair that was silver at the temples and a green dress that was appropriate to the occasion in the way of someone who had known there would be an occasion. She looked like my mother in the bone structure, and she looked completely unlike my mother in the expression. Where my mother moved through life with organized competence, this woman carried something more unresolved, something more searching, something that was looking for something it hadn't yet found. She was talking to my mother's oldest friend, Constance Whitfield, who I had known all my life, and Constance was listening with an expression I could not read from across the room. I crossed to my mother. She was at a table with my father and Theo's parents. I bent down and said quietly in her ear, "Mom, Rosalind is here." My mother went very still. She turned to look at me and her face did something I had never seen it do before. A brief, uncontrolled flash of something that was not quite surprise, which meant it was not entirely a surprise, which meant she knew, which meant, "You gave her the venue," I said. Not a question. My mother stood up. "Let's find somewhere to talk." We found a corner of the venue's side room, away from the reception. My father followed. Callum appeared from somewhere. Callum has an instinct for the moments that require his presence. And Jerome stayed at the table very discreetly, holding Archimedes' leash and being the kind of person who knows when to create space. My mother said, "She called me again. 3 weeks ago." Her health situation was worse than she had initially said. My mother paused. She was very clear that she might not have many more opportunities. She asked if she could come. Not officially, not on the list, just to see me. I told her the venue. I told her she could come after the ceremony to the reception and stay briefly. I told myself I would tell you afterward. A pause. I see now that was the wrong choice. You told yourself you would tell me afterward, I said very evenly. Yes. At my wedding. Yes. Without asking me. Yes. My mother looked at me with the specific look of a person who knows they have done wrong and has nothing to offer but honesty. I'm sorry, Delphine. I made the wrong call. I convinced myself it was for the best and I was wrong. My father said in his careful 3-sentence way, "Your mother has wanted her sister back for a long time. She made a bad decision about how to pursue that. She knows it was bad." Callum said nothing. He was watching me with the look he used when he was measuring the specific temperature of a situation before deciding how to move. I looked at my mother for a long moment. I looked at her the way you look at someone when you are recalibrating who they are. Not in the sense of finding them lesser, but in the sense of finding them fuller, more complicated, capable of things you hadn't mapped. She was a woman who had wanted her sister back. She had wanted it so badly that she had made a decision she knew, even as she made it, was wrong. She had built a story about managing it afterward. I had my father's precision about some things. I said, "I need to go back to my reception. I need to go back to my husband." I looked at my mother. "We will talk about this. Not tonight. Tomorrow." I went back to the reception. Theo was waiting for me at the edge of the dance floor with a particular composed attention that meant he had registered my absence and the quality of it. I took his hand. "I'll tell you later," I said. "Okay," he said. He squeezed my hand once and led me back to the floor. I danced at my own wedding knowing my estranged aunt was 30 feet away. I danced anyway. I am not telling you this to present myself as heroic. I am telling you because it is what you do when you have made a choice about what a day is going to mean and you choose to protect that meaning. The day was mine and Theo's. No one else had the right to take the meaning from it, and I refused to let them. But the thing Petra had said was still there. The thing about knowledge. The thing about what Rosalind had told Dr. Patricia. I found out what it was at 11:30 that night. The reception had wound down. Most guests had gone. The immediate family was still there, both sets of parents, Callum and Jerome, Petra. Rosalind was still there too, seated at a table near the back with my mother, who had apparently found her and who they were talking, quietly and with a weight I could see from across the room. Theo's mother, Dr. Patricia, found me. She was warm and direct and one of the people in my life I had come to love quickly and completely. She took my hand and said, "Your aunt told me something tonight. I want to make sure you know what she said because it's about your family, and it didn't feel like my information to have." We sat. Petra sat nearby, not intruding, present. Dr. Patricia told me what Rosalind had told her. I am going to tell you what I learned, and I am going to tell it clearly and without flinching, because it is the center of everything and because the honesty is the only way through. My mother, Lorraine, was not my grandparents' biological daughter. Lorraine Beaumont was adopted. She had been adopted at birth privately in 1963, in the specific way that private adoptions happened in the early 60s, quietly with paperwork managed by a family attorney with no public record, and with the understanding among the adults involved that the matter was closed. Rosalind was the biological daughter of my grandparents. Lorraine was not. My grandparents had decided, when Lorraine was young, not to tell her. This was not unusual for the era. This was, in fact, the default for mid-century private adoptions, the assumption that the information was better managed as silence, that the child would be loved without the complication of truth, that the love itself was what mattered and the origins were irrelevant. My grandparents had loved my mother genuinely and completely. The decision was made from love, or from a conception of love that the era supported. But Rosalind had known. Rosalind, for years younger, had been told when she was 12, because she had asked a question that required an answer, because children ask questions, and my grandparents had told her the truth in a way they had never told my mother. And Rosalind had carried that knowledge for her entire life, and the carrying of it, the weight of knowing something her sister did not know, the particular distortion that creates in a sibling relationship, was one of the fault lines that had eventually fractured them. The falling out, the estrangement, the thing my mother had described as choices Rosalind made that hurt the family. It had begun when Rosalind, in her mid-20s, had tried to tell my mother the truth. And my mother had not believed her. Had accused her of lying, of cruelty, of inventing something monstrous to destabilize her sense of family. And their mother, my grandmother, who died when I was 11, had denied it. Had denied it to protect the architecture she had built, to protect the version of the family she had constructed, to protect my mother from the truth she had decided my mother was better off not knowing. Rosalind had been called a liar by her mother and her sister. She had been told that what she knew was false, by the people who knew it was true. And she had eventually left. Not permanently, not entirely. She had made attempts over the years, had been partially reconciled at various points, but the core wound had never healed. Because the truth was still there, and my mother still didn't know it, and my grandmother had died with the secret intact. And now Rosalind was ill and facing the specific urgency of someone who understands that some things can only be said while there is still time to say them. She had told Dr. Patricia because Dr. Patricia was a historian. Because Rosalind had looked across the wedding reception at a woman whose life work was about the importance of truth in history, the importance of stories not being lost or buried, and she had made a connection that was perhaps not entirely rational but was entirely human. She had needed to say it to someone who would understand why it mattered. I sat across from Dr. Patricia and I let the information land. I want to describe what it feels like to discover that the story you have about your own family is built on a foundation that was laid differently than you believed. It is not quite like anything I have exact language for. It is not shock exactly because shock implies the body's emergency system, and what I felt was more like the slow shift of tectonic plates, not violent, not sudden, but enormous, and with the knowledge that the landscape is going to look different when it settles. I felt first something like grief, the grief of a particular story about my mother ending, the story in which she was fully known to herself, fully continuous with her origins. And then, underneath the grief, something stranger and more disorienting. A question. A very large, very quiet question. Does she know? I asked Dr. Patricia if Rosalind had indicated whether my mother had been told. Dr. Patricia shook her head. I don't think she has been. I think that's what Rosalind came here hoping to find the courage for. I sat with that. Theo was beside me. He had come over at some point, had heard at least part of it, was doing the thing he did, which was being present without requiring anything from me, just his hand near mine on the table. I said, I need to talk to Rosalind. It was almost midnight. The venue staff were finishing the cleanup around us with professional discretion. My mother was still at the table in the back with Rosalind, and from here I could see that their posture had changed. My mother's shoulders were different, less organized, something more exposed about the way she was sitting, and I understood that the conversation at that table had moved into territory that was significant. Petra put her hand briefly on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. Petra knows when words help and when they don't. I crossed the room. My mother looked up when I approached. Her eyes were red. Not from crying. My mother's eyes go red when she is containing something enormous, when the containment is costing her physiological effort. Rosalind looked at me with the searching expression I had noticed from across the room, and now up close it resolved into something more specific. She was looking at me the way you look at someone you have been thinking about for a long time and are finally in the same room with. I sat down at the table. I looked at Rosalind and I said calmly, I know what you told Dr. Asante. I want to hear it from you directly. Rosalind looked at my mother. My mother gave a very small nod. Rosalind told me. All of it. The same facts I had heard from Dr. Patricia, but in her voice with her history attached. The 12-year-old girl who was given a truth too large for her age and told to carry it quietly. The young woman who had tried to give her sister the truth and been called a liar. The decades of estrangement. The years of trying to find the right moment. The health diagnosis that had given urgency to a decision she had been postponing her whole adult life. She told it steadily, without drama, with the quality of a person who has rehearsed something for so long that the rehearsal has become honest. When she finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I looked at my mother. Did you know? I asked. Any of it? Any part of it? Have you known? My mother said very quietly. I found out 6 weeks ago. I looked at her. How? Rosalind sent me a letter. With documentation. Birth records. The attorney's files. His son found them in an estate archive after the old man died last year, and forwarded them to Rosalind because she had been the one who asked about the family years ago. My mother's voice was steady in the specific way of someone who has been crying for some time, and has arrived at the calm on the other side of it. I have known for 6 weeks. And she stopped. I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to tell any of you. I was trying to figure out who I was with this information before I gave it to anyone else. 6 weeks, I said. Yes. You knew for 6 weeks leading up to my wedding. Yes. I looked at her. I looked at her the way I had looked at her in the side room earlier, the recalibrating look, the look that finds someone fuller and more complicated. My mother had been, for 6 weeks, a person in the middle of the most fundamental rearrangement of her self-understanding, carrying it completely alone, continuing to plan a wedding, continuing to be the organized, competent, loving mother I had always known, while somewhere underneath all of that she was working out who she was. I have thought about this many times since. I have thought about the kind of strength it takes to function in the surface of your life while the underground of it is being excavated. I have thought about whether I would have done the same. I don't know. Think I might have. I think I might have needed the same thing my mother needed, which was time and privacy, and the internal work of figuring out who you are before you try to explain yourself to anyone else. I said, Mom, are you okay? She looked at me. Something in her face broke open slightly, just for a moment, just enough. No, she said. Not entirely. But I'm working on it. Okay, I said. My mother told me about the 6 weeks between receiving Rosalind's letter and the wedding. The particular shock of the first reading. She had read it twice before she believed it, and then she had gotten in her car and driven for 40 minutes with nowhere to go, just driving, which was a thing my mother had never in my memory done, and which told me the magnitude of the impact better than any description of emotion could. She had called Rosalind. They had talked for the first time in years, and it had been difficult and necessary, and the documentation had turned out to be complete, birth records, adoption records, the attorney's files, a letter from my grandmother written in 1978 and never sent, apparently, to anyone, in which she addressed my mother by name and tried to explain a decision she knew, even then, was unresolvable. The letter from my grandmother. My mother had it with her. She showed it to me. I will not reproduce it here because it is private and because I believe some things belong to the people they were written for. But I will tell you that it was a mother's letter, and that it was full of love in the complicated way that love is complicated when it is also a decision, also a management, also a choice about what truth to protect someone from and what truth to allow them. My grandmother had loved my mother. The love was not in question. What was in question was the shape the love had been allowed to take, the architecture of protection it had constructed, and whether the protection had served my mother or served my grandmother's need for the story to remain intact. I do not have a clean answer to that question. I don't think there is one. After I read the letter, I was quiet for a while. Then I said, "Do you want to know who your biological family is? If it's findable." My mother looked at her coffee. "I've been sitting with that question for 6 weeks," she said. "I don't know yet. I think I might want to know something. I don't know how much something." "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to decide yet." "I keep thinking," she said slowly, "about the fact that I am 61 years old, and I have had a full life. I have been loved by parents who chose me, by a husband who I chose, by children who didn't choose me but who I got to have anyway." She paused. "The story of who I am is not changed by this. The story is added to. That's different." I looked at her. She was 61 and she had been reorganizing the foundation of her self-understanding for 6 weeks, and she was still functioning, still here, still making coffee at this table with the organizational competence that was the through line of her adult life. I felt something for her in that moment that was distinct from the love I had always had for her, something more peer-like, something that recognized her as a person who had been dealt something enormous and was handling it with grace. "You're remarkable," I told her. "I just want to say that directly." She looked at me. She said, "You are too. The way you handled the wedding night, the way you went back to that dance floor." She shook her head. "I was watching you. I was so proud of you and so ashamed of myself at the same time." "You don't have to be ashamed," I said. "You made a bad call. You know it was a bad call. That's the whole thing." "I should have told you," she said. "About the letter, about Rosalind, about all of it. I should have told you months before the wedding, and I didn't because I was afraid of what it would cost. I was protecting the day." "I know," I said. "I was protecting the wrong thing," she said. "I should have been protecting you." "You were protecting yourself too," I said. "And that's allowed. You were allowed to need time to process this before involving anyone else. You just needed to let the time be time, not a decision." We sat with that for a while. Then my mother said something that I have turned over many times since, that I have come to believe is one of the truest things I have heard. "I think Rosalind has been carrying the correct story for 30 years and I called it a lie. And she kept loving me anyway. Not perfectly. Not without damage. But she kept loving me. I don't know how to account for that." I thought about this. "Maybe that's the conversation you need to have with her," I said. My mother nodded. "I think so." Callum, when I told him, was quiet for a long time and then said, "So we're a different family than we thought." "We're an addition to the family we thought," I said. "The family we thought is still real." He sat with that. "Okay," he said eventually. "Okay, I can work with that." Jerome, who had been in the room and who was exactly the kind of person who should be in rooms when difficult things are processed, said nothing. He just quietly made everyone sandwiches, which is the kindest thing a person can do in a situation where there is nothing useful to say. Theo, when I told him everything from the conversation with my mother, said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you to keep being yourself," I said. "That's actually everything I need." He pulled me in. He held on. "I want to tell you about Rosalind now. The real Rosalind, the one I came to know in the months after the wedding, not the ghost category she had occupied in my family mythology, but the actual person. We met for lunch 6 weeks after the wedding. A restaurant in Durham, halfway between where she was living now. She had moved back to North Carolina, to a town near the coast, when the health situation had clarified, and where I was. She arrived first. I saw her through the window before I went in, and I sat with the observation for a moment, She was a woman in a green dress. Not the same green as the wedding, a different green, somehow her color. And she was reading something on her phone with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely interested in whatever they're reading rather than passing time. Something about this made her more real to me than any prior version of her. She was warm in person. Complicated warm. The warmth of someone who has been alone with difficult things for a long time, and is not practiced at easy social warmth but is genuinely trying. She had a sense of humor that was dry and specific. She had opinions about things, books, the current state of regional architecture, a documentary series she had recently watched, and she expressed them with the directness of someone who has spent enough of her life managing what she said and is no longer interested in managing it. We talked about my mother first, carefully. We talked about the estrangement, the full version, her version, which I had not had before. She told me about the conversation in her mid-20s when she had tried to tell my mother the truth, and I listened to it with the understanding that there were two versions of this story, and both of them contained people who were doing what they believed was right, and both of them were also doing damage. She was not a villain in the story she told about herself. Neither was my mother. They were two women in the middle of an impossible architecture, and the architecture had broken them apart. She told me about the years of trying to come back, the partial reconciliations that collapsed when the central truth remained untouched, the letters she had written and not sent, the health diagnosis, kidney disease, managed but chronic, the kind that changes your relationship to time, that had finally clarified what had always been the choice, say it or don't, and understand that the choosing has a closing date. I asked her, "Why Dr. Patricia? At the wedding? Of all the people to tell?" Rosalind was quiet for a moment. "I had had 2 glasses of wine," she said, with a frankness that made me laugh unexpectedly. "And I saw a woman who studied history, and I thought, here is someone who understands why a buried story is not the same as a resolved one. I thought she would understand why it had to come out." She paused. "I was not thinking clearly about the setting. I am sorry for that." "I know," I said. "I believe you." "Are you angry at me?" she asked. Not defensively. Genuinely. I thought about it honestly. I was angry at the wedding. I'm not angry now. I think I'm in the middle of something with you. I think we are at the very beginning of something, and I don't know what it is yet, and I'm okay with not knowing. She looked at me for a moment. "You remind me of your grandmother," she said. "The way she was before. The way she used to face things directly." "Tell me about her," I said. "The version you knew. Not the version that became the one who made decisions I'm still untangling. The person." And she did. She talked about my grandmother for an hour, the woman who had been a seamstress and a community organizer and a deeply funny person at card tables and a reader of paperback mysteries and a baker of a specific cake that apparently no one has been able to reproduce since she died. She talked about her with love, with complexity, with the particular quality of grief that belongs to people who loved someone who also hurt them, which is not uncomplicated but is entirely real. I found myself in the middle of this lunch, receiving a version of my family history I had not had before. Not a better version, more complete, more honest. A version that had more people in it, more shadow and more light, more of the messy truth of the actual past rather than the managed simplicity of the inherited version. Something opened in me during that lunch. I don't have a more precise word for it than that. Opened, like a room that had been kept shut because nobody was quite sure what was in it, and it turned out what was in it was difficult, yes, and also inhabited and also worth knowing. I am going to tell you about something that happened 5 months after the wedding that I was not expecting, and that I want to tell you about carefully. My mother decided she wanted to know. She had been sitting with the question of her biological origins for 5 months. She had been in therapy. She started seeing a therapist in June, which was, for my mother, a very significant departure from her default mode of managing things internally through organizational competence, and which told me the size of what she was processing. She had been in ongoing conversation with Rosalind, carefully, incrementally, and then in October she called me and said, "I think I want to know who my birth parents were. Not to replace anything, just to know the full story." The search took 3 months. It was not as difficult as it might have been. The documentation Rosalind had recovered from the attorney's estate was comprehensive, and with those records a search specialist was able to trace the biological family relatively quickly. My mother's birth parents had both died. Her birth mother had died in 2004. Her birth father earlier than that. But there was a family. There was a daughter. my mother's biological half-sister, who was alive, living in Georgia, who had not known my mother existed until the search specialist made contact. Her name was Adiz. She was 55. She was a retired nurse with 3 adult children and a manor on the phone, when she and my mother first spoke, that Theo later described, after my mother told us the story, as someone who has spent her whole life taking care of difficult things and has gotten very good at it. I was not in the room for that first call. It was my mother's. But I heard about it afterward, and my mother's description of it is one of the things I have turned to repeatedly when I need a reminder of what human beings are capable of. She said that Adiz had picked up the phone and, after the explanation, had been quiet for a long moment. And then she had said, "I knew something was missing from my mother's story. I always felt it, but I didn't know what it was." A pause. "I'm glad you called." They talked for 2 hours. My mother called me afterward, and I could hear in her voice the specific quality of someone who has had a fundamental piece of information restored to them. Not happiness exactly, not completion, but the particular relief of a question that has been answered. Not all questions. Not the hard ones about why and what it cost. But the central factual one, the who. I thought after that call about Rosalind, about the 30 years she had spent knowing something that my mother didn't know, carrying the correct version of the story while the official family version ran alongside it as a kind of shadow. I thought about what it had cost her, the estrangement, the accusations, the years of distance. I thought about why she had kept coming back, kept trying, kept showing up at a wedding she hadn't been invited to with urgency in her body and a truth she had been waiting 30 years to tell. She had kept coming back because she loved my mother. The love had survived the estrangement, had survived the accusations, had survived 30 years of silence broken only by attempts that failed. It had survived because it was the kind of love that doesn't require reciprocity in order to persist, the kind that endures the absence of the person it belongs to without requiring the absence to be resolved on a particular timeline. Rosalind had simply kept loving my mother from a distance, waiting for the moment when the truth could land, willing to absorb whatever the landing cost. My mother, when I put this to her, I know, and I don't know how to make it right. I don't know if right is even the available destination anymore. Maybe right isn't the destination, I said. Maybe it's just further. Maybe the destination is just further along. My mother thought about that. I can go further along, she said. I think that's what I can do. Now I want to talk about what all of this taught me about my own marriage. Because the unexpected thing about a revelation that arrives at your wedding is that it forces you into the earliest days of your marriage with some very large questions already active, and those questions, navigated well, can become the foundation of the specific kind of partnership that sustains. Theo and I talked about all of it. Not just the facts are easy to relay, they're just information, but the interior experience of it. I told him about the moment in the side room with my mother, and what it was like to discover that the person I thought I knew completely had a hidden layer. He told me about watching me go back to the dance floor after that conversation, and what it had made him feel, which was something he described with characteristic precision. Proud, and aware that I had married someone who can protect what matters without losing track of what's happening. I told him about my grandfather's letter, and about the specific question of what love looks like when it becomes management, when protection becomes a form of control over someone else's story. He told me about his parents' marriage, the ways his father's early emotional unavailability had cost them years before his mother had named it directly and they had worked through it. We talked about the stories families carry, and the stories they bury, and the difference between privacy and suppression. These conversations, the real ones, the ones that went late and uncomfortable and honest, are, I now understand, the actual architecture of a marriage. Not the ceremony, not the vows which matter, but which are the announcement, not the building. The building is what you do in the kitchen at 11 at night when you are tired and the thing you need to say is not easy and you say it anyway, and the person receives it and responds with their whole self, and you do this over and over until it becomes the structure you live inside. I am 8 months into this marriage. I want to be honest about what I know and what I don't. I know that Theo is a person I can tell the difficult thing to. I know that I am a person who can tell the difficult thing, which is a capacity I did not fully trust in myself before this year. I know that my parents are people who made a significant mistake from love, and who are accountable for it, and who are good parents, and that all three of those things are true. I know that Rosalind is someone I am in the early weeks of actually knowing, which is a stranger and more hopeful thing than the ghost category she inhabited for 30 years. I know that my mother is in the process of something, an integration, a reconciliation with a story about herself that is larger than the one she had, and that it is difficult and will continue to be difficult, and that she is not alone in it. I know that Adiz in Georgia has children who are technically my mother's biological nieces and nephews, and that this family exists in the world, and that what we do with that existence is a long, ongoing, entirely optional question that doesn't need to be answered on any particular schedule. I know that Petra, who stood at my elbow at 8 o'clock on my wedding night and said there is a woman here who seems to know things she shouldn't, was and is one of the great gifts of my adult life, and that I told her so explicitly and in those words, the week after we returned from Portugal. She said, "Obviously. I've known for 11 years. I know," I said. I wanted to say it out loud. She said, "Good. Say things out loud. That's the whole lesson of the last 2 months." She was right. That is the whole lesson. Not just of the last 2 months, of all of it. Of my grandmother's unsent letter, of Rosalind's 30 years of carrying the correct story, of my mother's 6 weeks in the middle of a private earthquake, of every moment I have described to you in this long honest telling that I have been composing for weeks, not because I needed strangers on the internet to tell me it wasn't my fault, but because the composing itself is a kind of resolution, a kind of saying out loud that makes the thing more real and more finished and more mine. Say things out loud. Tell the people who love you the inside of your life, not just the surface. Do not wait for the right moment, because the right moment is a myth constructed by fear. Say the imperfect draft of it. Say it now, while the person is still in the room, still reachable, still yours to speak to. My grandmother wrote a letter she never sent. My mother carried a reconstructed identity for 6 weeks in silence. Rosalind carried the correct story for 30 years before anyone was ready to receive it. And I stood on a dance floor in May with all of this unknowingly underneath me, dancing with the man I had married, holding on to the day with both hands, choosing what the day would mean. The day meant what I said it meant. Still does. My name is Delphine Morrow. I am 33 years old. 8 months ago I married the right person, at the right time, surrounded by 200 people who loved us. My aunt arrived without an invitation and brought a truth that rearranged everything. I am grateful for both things. Not equally, not without complexity, but genuinely and increasingly grateful for both. That is the whole story. Or rather, it is not the whole story, because the whole story is still happening, still adding chapters, still finding the right shape. Adiz's family and what we make of knowing them. My mother's therapy and what she finds on the other side of it. Rosalind's health and the particular urgency of a relationship being built in awareness of limited time. Theo and me, and the specific daily work of being the partnership we said we would be on a Saturday in May with the gold afternoon light coming through the windows. The story is ongoing. That's the only way a story that matters gets to be. Edit. I wrote this over several weeks and almost didn't post it. I'm glad I did. To everyone who said some version of, "I needed this today. I needed to say it." That exchange is the thing. Edit 2. Several people have asked about Rosalind's health. She is stable. The chronic nature of her condition means it is managed rather than resolved, but she is here, and she and my mother spoke on the phone last night for an hour about a book they are both reading, which is, I don't have a word for what that is. I just know it matters. Edit 3. To the person who messaged me to say their family has a secret of similar magnitude and they have been the one carrying it alone. You don't have to wait 30 years. You really don't. There is no right moment. There is just now and now and now. I hope you find your now soon.